precipitating some concessions from the Roosevelt administration. Although these demonstrations did not get the national attention that post-war protests would, they continued to prelude to the civil rights movement. As rural Americans moved to northern and western industrial hubs, many farm countries experienced a labor shortage. So in an ironic reversal, local and federal authorities who before the war had forced Mexican migrant laborers and their American children back across the Mexican border now recruited them to harvest crops on American farms. The Mexican government, however, would not consent to provide the laborers until the U.S. promised to ensure them decent working and living conditions. The result was the creation of the Bracero Program in 1942. So the agreement stipulated that Mexico agreed to provide seasonal farm workers on year-long contracts. Under this program, some 200,000 Mexican farm workers entered the United States, the Western United States, and at least as many or more than this entered the U.S. as undocumented workers. Most U.S. residents of Mexican ancestry were American citizens. Like many other Americans, they settled into jobs to help fight the war, while more than 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the armed forces. The war heightened Mexican Americans' consciousness of their civil rights. Wartime civil rights organizations led to the creation of the unity leagues and organizations such as the League of United Latin American Citizens, so it's also known as LULAC. LULAC was a largely middle-class group that challenged racial discrimination and segregation in public accommodations. Mexican American citizens encountered hostility from whites throughout the South and the Southwest. Throughout the West and the Southwest. So the tensions were greatest in Los Angeles. A group of Mexican American teenagers joined what were seen as gangs in hopes of protecting themselves, and they identified themselves by wearing zoot suits, which were colorful, long, loose-fitting jackets with padded shoulders and baggy pants that were tapered at the bottom. We can see some zoot suits here in this image. So not all zoot suiters were quote-unquote gang members, but many outside of their own communities failed to make this distinction. So sailors stationed at naval bases in Southern California found their dress and swagger provocative. And on the night of June 4th, 1943, soldiers stationed in Long Beach invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods in East LA, indiscriminately assaulted both zoot suiters and those not dressed in this clothing on the streets. And this would spark what's known as the Zoot Suit riots. So the police sided with the sailors and arrested Mexican-American youth who tried to fight back. After 4 days, the Zoot Suit riots ended as civilian and military authorities restored order. And in response, the LA City Council banned the wearing of zoot suits in public and named it a criminal offense. So almost 1/3 of eligible Native American men served in the armed forces. Many others worked in defense-related industries, and thousands of women volunteered as nurses. So unlike Black Americans, Native American servicemen were integrated into white units with white Americans. Perhaps their most distinctive role was serving as what is known as code talkers. So every military branch used Native folks, especially Navajos, to encode and decipher messages using indigenous language unknown to the Germans and Japanese. World War II marked a significant crossroads for the protection of civil liberties. So in general, the federal government did not repress civil liberties as harshly as it had during World War I, primarily because opposition to World War II was not nearly as great. The chief potential for radical dissent came from the Communist Party, but after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, communists and their sympathizers rallied behind the war effort and did whatever they could to stifle any protest that threatened the goal of defeating Germany. On the other side of the political spectrum, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, conservative isolationists in the America First movement quickly threw their support behind the war. Of the three ethnic groups associated with the Axis powers, the Japanese, Germans, and Italians, Japanese Americans received by far the worst treatment from the civilian population and state and federal officials. Germans had experienced animosity and repression during World War I, but like Italian immigrants, they had generally assimilated into the wider population. Especially because immigration restrictions of the 1920s had reduced the portion of first-generation European immigrants, Americans to a much larger extent had come to accept new immigrants that we've been talking about as loyal Americans, so they had come to be considered as racially white. As a result, they suffered fewer violations of their civil rights than Japanese Americans. The internment or forced relocation and detainment of some Italian and Germans in the US during World War II paled in comparison with that of Japanese Americans. So the government established a system that questioned German and Italian Americans on an individual basis if their loyalty came under suspicion. By contrast, US officials identified all Japanese and Japanese Americans within the nation that they associated all Japanese and Japanese Americans with the nation that attacked Pearl Harbor. Idaho's governor at the time, he said, quote, "A good solution to the Jap problem would be to send them all back to Japan, then sink the island," end quote. So this was a really common thought during this time, especially by those in government. So following Pearl Harbor, white Americans on the West Coast, where nearly all people of Japanese descent lived, whipped themselves up into a frenzy of anti-Japanese hysteria. They convinced themselves that all Japanese were a threat to the US and liable to pass military intelligence on to Japan. FDR initiated the relocation when he issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, authorizing the forcible removal of all ethnic Japanese living on the Pacific Coast. Roosevelt and some military officials called the action a military necessity, although not a single incident of espionage involving Japanese Americans was proven. German officials relocated all of those living there, citizens and non-citizens alike, to barbed wire enclosed internment camps scattered across remote areas in the West. As it turned out, more than 70% of the 120,000 Japanese who were evicted and detained were American citizens. The first step towards civil rights abuses against racial minorities or other marginalized groups is always the dehumanization of these individuals and groups. And the quickest way to dehumanize people is to think of them as a faceless, indistinguishable mob. So, I think people often say today, that won't happen now. I can't believe this happened then. I can't believe we did this. But then we see waves of racial violence against Asian Americans as a result of COVID-19, or a rise in discrimination against Muslims, or this growing fear of immigrants coming from Central and South America.
My mother kept a diary from the day that she married. It's kind of heart-wrenching. She starts out with all this hopefulness, finding the love of her life and looking forward to having a family. 9 months later, they find themselves imprisoned. They were removed to the Tanforan racetrack, which was a temporary detention facility. If you had 1/16 Japanese blood, even if you were a baby in an orphanage, you were put in an orphanage in one of the camps. This was based on race. My mother had morning sickness and placed in a horse stable where they could still smell the manure. And she wrote in her diary that she was sick every day and unable to eat. She was concerned about what was happening to the baby that was growing inside of her. From there, they were sent to Topaz, Utah. There, my brother was born. There was so much turmoil inside the camp. There were factions. those that were supportive of the administration. And then there was a growing resistance. That resistance movement gave them a place where they could feel some personal dignity by opposing the oppressive conditions, the terrible food. There was not enough milk for the children. There was a limit on how much coal you could have to heat the rooms.